Hey everyone, welcome back. We are moving on to the second lecture of the Standard 1.1 for U.S. history. Today we're going to talk about transforming America and some of the things that we talked about in the last lecture about the innovations, industrialization, and then some of the other things that also help pursue the transformation of America, especially as it comes to what happens as a result of Western expansion. So today we're going to once again, hit standard 1.1. I'm not going to read the entire thing again, but again, we're going to focus mainly on how it transformed America. And there's a lot of things we can say that happened as a result of industrialization. I even kind of talked about some of that stuff a little bit last time, but we're going to talk about something that isn't as directly related to this standard. I mean, it is, but there are some other implications that aren't. How do I put? Specified in the standard that we as U.S. history teachers feel it necessary to talk about when we're talking about how industrialization does transform America. So today we have an essential questions: identify and explain three ways in which America changed as a result of industrialization and Western expansion. So the first thing, we talked about the railroads last time, and the railroads, they bring a lot of changes, which we covered a little bit last time, but there's some other things that happen. Demographically, there are some major impacts of the railroads themselves. Number one, we talked about, it helps pursue and facilitate Western settlement much faster and made it much easier for people to be able to take their, pack all their things, put on a train, and go westward that way, rather than the first generation of Western settlers who came by wagons and hand carts and so forth. And so it definitely helps facilitate the movement of people into the West, which was a big motivating factor for why the United States government helps fund a lot of not fund, but give a lot of support to the railroads themselves. Another thing that it does is that because of the railroads needing such a large amount of labor, they are going to find that labor in the form of immigrants typically. It's not 100% immigrant labor, but the vast majority of the people that worked on the railroads and helped build the railroads were immigrants. And there were two main groups of immigrants that are heavily responsible for certainly the transcontinental railroad, and that was the Irish and the Chinese. Now, the Irish came here, as we'll learn a bit more about that in a different standard, but a lot of them came here because of the Irish potato famine. And when they came here, there was limited amount of work in some of the cities. Not only that, but the Irish were generally farmers, and their skill sets were limited. And not to mention, there was also a certain amount of prejudice against the Irish at this time too. So where they could find work was in these highly demanding jobs that require a lot of labor and such. Was definitely the railroads, right? So many of the Irish, they get recruited in the cities of Boston, New York, and such, and then they go out west, and then they help build the railroads. There's not just the Irish that are coming from that are building from the east towards the west. You can also say a lot of freed slaves were part of that as well. So were some former Confederates looking for work since the economy was destroyed after the Civil War. As generally, just wage earners looking for work at the same time. So, but definitely you can't ignore the Irish. Now, from the west. For those who were building from California inland, that through the Rocky Mountains largely was done by the Chinese. And a lot of the Chinese were recruited and brought here by steamboats to places like San Francisco, where they would get them into the railroad business and so forth, and they would help build a railroad. The idea being, well, the Chinese build great things like the Great Wall of China, and so they are very capable of helping build those railroads as well. Now, the eastbound routes, the one that's coming from the west, going towards the east, so going through the Rocky Mountains, we're going through much tougher terrain. And so they had to go either through passes, and a lot of tunnels were made as well. And this is very, very dangerous work. And in order to clear the rocks that made to make these tunnels, they were using things like nitroglycerin. This is before TNT becomes more popularized and more of a stable explosive. So liquid nitrogen, which is highly unstable, was used as a way to clear those passes with the explosions. And they would only allow the Chinese. They would basically, the Chinese were the only ones that would use this stuff because it was so dangerous. Give you an understanding that a lot of the people who were in charge of this saw the Chinese as expendable in some way, right? Anyway, so that's one of the challenges that took place in trying to build through the Rocky Mountains, and the eastbound or the westward bound section of the Transcontinental Railroad was going through the Great Plains, which they did not have as many challenges, but they were also able to build a larger amount of track because the landscape was not as rough to go through. So, the westward movement and railroads certainly help facilitate more westward movement and such, but it's not the only thing that's kind of pushing people out west at this time. In 1862, during the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln's government and the radical Republicans that controlled Congress at the time very much wanted to pursue a means of settling the West at a much faster rate. And in order to do this, they passed something called the Homestead Act. And when this was passed, essentially, it gave everyone who signed up for this program 160 acres of land for basically, you got it if you met these qualifications. Number one, you were an American citizen. And to qualify as being an American citizen was much easier back then than it was today. People who came off the boat from Ireland, were basically said, hey, welcome to America. Here's your citizenship. Now that you're a citizen, go fight the Civil War. Go help build the railroads, things like that, right? So being an American citizen was number one. 21 years of old and head of the household. And so typically that was male dominated in that time period. They were committed to building the house. They had to commit to building a house on that land, and they had to live there for at least 6 months of the year. They didn't have to live there the entirety of the year. They can move out there, do some farming, and then move back to a city to get some extra cash. So that was fine. But they had to be in residence at least 6 months of the year. They had to pay a $10 fee. At that time, $10 is more than what $10 is today, but still a relatively good deal when we're talking about 160 acres of land. Now, they got to keep that land. So essentially the 5 years that they got 5 years of lease from the government to make that land farmable. If they could make the land farmable and profitable, then they were allowed to keep it. If not, it goes back into the hands of the U.S. government, and the U.S. government would use it however they saw fit. They could give somebody else a chance to try to make the land farmable. But and it wasn't always easy, and there was a lot of homesteaders who end up failing and going back to the cities for work. My great-great-grandparents, maybe I need another great or one less great, I can't recall, moved out to a place called Gillette, Wyoming as homesteaders. And they attempted to do soil farming, and it failed. And so they had to go back east to Pennsylvania. So we have a little bit of history in my family of being homesteaders, but we failed at it. So we're not the best example of that. So, and by the way, when I say my family, I mean my ancestors, not me, right? I'm not that old. Nearly 85 million acres of land end up becoming privately owned for this program. 270 million acres altogether were settled. That's roughly somewhere between 9 to 30% of the U.S. lands were settled by this act. So you can see how much of an impact it had in transforming America. It helped push more people westward. And in doing so, it also transforms in other ways. Okay. So farming the Great Plains, again, it was a very difficult thing to do. A lot of the places that they're moving into don't have trees naturally. So they had to build their houses out of soil and sod. They would basically cut up the sod out of the grass and then stack it like bricks. And it was effective, but probably not very homey feeling, but it could provide some shelter. The conditions were very tough. The soil was rough. And yeah, I did rhyme that on purpose. You're also dealing with environmental factors like weather. It could be very hot and dry at certain parts of the year. Winters were darn near deadly with, wind chill. the great winds of the Great Plains whipping through that cold blizzard air. That's something that was very, very difficult. So the homesteaders that succeeded were the toughest and hardest working of the bunch, and they made that land work. And today, a lot of that land is transformed completely, but much more so because of improvement of technology nowadays than it was for the homesteaders, right? The Department of Agriculture, which was created along the lines of when the Homestead Act came along, put out like manuals of how to farm and how to best make this land work. And so they taught new techniques in farming. The homesteaders themselves didn't get a whole lot of support from the government because, hey, they were just, the government was told them go make it work and try to farm that land successfully, and you get to keep it. So homesteaders became very resourceful at trying to share resources and use every means they could within their communities to make the land work. For example, if they needed to buy a combine of some kind, those were very expensive. And so you could have 4 or 5 families all buy into this combine and then like share it during certain times of harvest season that would make it work that way. So, they found ways to make it happen. I mentioned last time the development of bonsai farming, bonanza farming. Bonanza farming, which they would focus on 1 or 2 types of crops, and typically wheat was one of those crops. So the production of food increases significantly as a result of the Homestead Act, as well as some of the innovations in agriculture that we talked about last time. And by doing so, it allowed population growth to increase. But they also were able to produce so much food that prices dropped so much. And that might be great for the consumers, but for farmers, it made it very difficult for them to hold on to their farms because no matter how much they farmed, it could not necessarily always make ends meet. And so it made it hard for them to afford to keep paying their mortgages and so on and so forth. So this is something that, is an issue with farming even today. The prices of food, trying to find the balance of what is good for the consumer and for Americans, as well as what's good for the farmer, right? So when these homesteaders moved out west, there were a lot of homesteaders that came and such. And so a lot of women and African Americans and other minority groups end up moving out westward in an attempt to try to find a sense of freedom and live that ideal of American dream, right? For women, they must have been the toughest women that you could ever imagine because a lot of them, not only are they partaking in the back-breaking labor that is required to help manage and maintain these lands, while at the same time having families and everything. Husbands oftentimes left the home and went back into the cities or towns to try to find work that helped pay the bills. And so women often were left at home during those non-harvesting seasons to make sure that they can continue to have a claim on that land. Now, as a result, in the Western states, women had a lot more political power. Anybody here probably doesn't know, and a lot of people in Utah misconceive it, but the first state to allow women the right to vote was the state of Wyoming. And part of that is because when Wyoming wanted to gain statehood, they didn't have the population do so unless they allowed women to have the vote. Other states like Utah followed suit, and they would give women a lot more rights and the right to vote more so. And so a big reason for why the women's suffrage movement, the movement to try to gain women the right to vote, starts in the Western states because they had already been given more power because they needed to, and then it kind of moves eastward eventually in the 19 teens and then 1920s when the 19th Amendment's passed. So African Americans, a lot of them do pursue West and such. A lot of them are still stay in the South for this time being, and even still the truth today about that. But For those who could, they tried to move westward to get a hold of some land and some opportunities out west. And many of the African Americans who were freed from slavery got into the railroad business, and many of them became cowboys. And they were the first cowboys that helped drive cattle, which I'll talk about in the next slide or a couple slides. So they became known as the Exodusters. They are like the first wave. There's going to be other ones that come later. But less than 20% of this group became successful farmers. Just like everywhere else, they found it difficult. Everyone else found it difficult to do farming in the Great Plains when you compare it to the South, where it's much more fertile soil, much more um, agreeable environmental climates and environmental conditions. So yes, African Americans were and former Confederates were essentially the first cattle drivers after the Civil War. Settlers in Texas learned how cattle ranching worked from the Mexicans who lived there beforehand. Remember, Texas was part of Mexico until it was broken off by the settlers, American settlers, and then later became part of the United States in 1846. But 1845. Settlers, when the Civil War was over, the meat industry, the cattle and such, a lot of them put to slaughter. Number one, for the war purposes of feeding soldiers, and number two, a lot of the cattle was destroyed by the North and the South to help push the end of the war faster. And so when the Civil War was over, there was not enough meat back east. And so where they found it was Texas. And so that's where we started to see these long cattle drives where they would push these cattle and drive them northward up into the railroad stations along the Transcontinental Railroad. So places like Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is my hometown, Ogallala, Nebraska. These were along the railroads, and so they drove these cattle upwards here, and then they get them onto these rail cars, and then they move them back east to cities like Chicago, Kansas City, St. Louis, where they had big slaughterhouses, and they would slaughter the meat and package it and send back east to be sold, right? So those are things that happened, as a result of westward expansion. You saw the cattle drives. Now the cattle drives only lasted for so long because it really created a lot of conflict with farmers. Imagine you're trying to grow wheat on your land, and all of a sudden, and you're a homesteader, and all of a sudden here comes this giant parade of cattle that are tromping through your crops, eating the crops and such. Cowboys and farmers certainly, were not each other's friends. As I mentioned last time, one of the things, the innovations that really transforms the West was the invention of barbed wire. And by doing so, they fenced off the West and made it so that cattle driving was just no longer possible, because it created issues when you were cutting through people's fences. And so that's the reason why they do stop. But that is something the ranching and the farming westward helped transform America in that way. Now, as a result of Western movement, you cannot ignore the fact that the impact on Native Americans is going to be devastating. And we talked about in Unit Zero how Native Americans have been pushed off their land ever since European settlers started to make settlements in the 13 colonies. And as Western settlers continue to push further and further west, Native Americans get pushed further away from their ancestral homelands. There have been a number of treaties, and I don't know how many in terms of numbers, but I'm talking probably hundreds, maybe thousands of treaties that the Native American tribes signed with Western or white settlers, and so they could preserve some lands for themselves and such, that were ended up violated by the United States government and other white settlers as well. And oftentimes how it goes is they make the treaty, And then, after that treaty is signed, they discovered there's some sort of resource on that land that they want, the white settlers, the U.S. government, and then ends up, people going in to come take it, and either the Native Americans have to leave or they start to resist, and sometimes they resist violently. And we'll talk about some examples of that today. In 1867, it's basically declared that the Native Americans would have to move to Oklahoma and South Dakota into reservations, large reservations. And we're talking about land that was not the best of land a lot of times. And at the same time, you have many different tribes that are being forced into these very dense quarters, comparatively to the lifestyle that they had lived before. Sometimes we have tribes that were enemies living on the same reservation. So you can imagine that it was a very different way of living for them in a lot of ways, right? So as far as resistance go, one of the examples of resistance to the U.S. Government and white settlers moving westward were the Sioux. The Sioux is a name that is given to this tribe by other tribes. It actually transforms into enemy, but by their own tribal name, they're known as the Lakota. But in 1868, they had agreed to move into the reservations in the Black Hills, South Dakota. The Black Hills, if you're not familiar with that, that is the place in where the Mount Rushmore was built. But it was not built until after the Lakota people and the Sioux were taken off those lands or pushed off those lands. The reason why it doesn't work out in the long run as a reservation, because in 1874 there's gold that's discovered in the Black Hills, and so you have miners and prospectors who are moving into that land, and they are taking the gold, they're destroying the land, and so forth. And this is land that's considered sacred to the Lakota people. Even the mountain or the hill, the rock face, whatever you want to describe it as, where Mount Rushmore was constructed or carved, was considered a sacred site for the Lakota people. But the Sioux, basically leave the reservation. They do not, if they're going to be pushed off their land, they're just going to leave. And they were going to be led by a guy named Chief Sitting Bull. And Chief Sitting Bull took his people and pursued, a place where he could, live in peace. However, the United States government didn't like this, and they sent in the United States Cavalry, led by General George Armstrong Custer, who is the gentleman here on the left. This is Sitting Bull, and this is General Custer. And his job was to round them up and put them back into the reservations, so that white settlers could settle the West without feeling threatened by Native Americans themselves. So the Battle of Little Bighorn ends up happening as a result of this. Is probably the most famous of the battles in the Indian Wars. And Custer, found the hiding spots of the Sioux tribes and such in Little Bighorn Valley, which is in Idaho. And in June 1876, he orders his troops, which he has roughly 600 cavalry soldiers, to attack the village of the Sioux, and they were somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 strong. So right away, they are outnumbered by a lot. Not only that, but George Armstrong splits his forces to try to do what's called a pincer move, to try to kind of come from the sides. He grossly misunderestimates the size of the village, and him and his men get slaughtered, to say the least. Right? He himself is also killed too. This is the last major victory of the Native American tribes in resisting the white settlements or the whites moving westward at that time. This is a picture. If you go to Little Bighorn today, the memorial and such, all these little gravestones represent where one of the soldiers died, and you can see over here is where the camp was, and as they were trying to escape, they're all kind of dying and eventually get surrounded and killed. The Nez Perce is another example of resistance to what happens, and they were a tribe that practiced a ceremony called the ghost dance. And the ghost dance kind of combined some ideas, some elements of Christianity as with the tribal religious beliefs of their ancestors. So the dance itself was performed, and the idea was that they would perform it, and then it would eventually get rid of all the white men. It would bring back the buffalo, which I've failed to mention that the buffalo were being slaughtered in large numbers because as the railroads move out westward, they would pull. I mean, the buffalo, which were millions strong, would be in the Great Plains. All they had to do was stop the train next to these big herds of buffalo, and then with Winchester rifles and so forth, they would just shoot from the train, kill the buffalo, skin them, and then they would sell the hides back east, which would turn into a lot of times belts that were used in the machinery. But the buffalo was the primary food source of the Western Great Plains tribes Indians. And so by destroying their food source, it really just is destroying the way of life for the Native Americans. So by bringing back the buffalo, they were hoping to restore their ancestral ways and continue to practice the culture that they have practiced for centuries. Okay. They also said it would bring back their ancestors, and then they would also, not the ceremony itself, but the garment that they wore during the ceremony would make them invincible to bullets. Now, this sort of behavior and this sort of like ceremony terrified many of the whites, and then a lot of it is because of lack of understanding of what the purposes of this was. They saw it as the Native Americans working themselves up to a frenzy, and that it would threaten them and their livelihoods. And so, federal troops were sent in to try to control this and to stop the Native Americans from doing things that were making them uncomfortable, and so forth. And this ends up leading to one of the most terrible massacres that occur, not the only one, of Native Americans during the Indian Wars. And so, when they left the reservation again, they were rounded up by federal cavalry, and they've got them all kind of surrounded to disarm them. And then as they're disarming them, there was a shot that rang out, and nobody knows who fired it. It could have been cavalry. It could have been one of the Native Americans. Most historians will say it was probably a cavalry soldier, or there was an accidental discharge. But as soon as it happened, they shot and killed over 200 women, children, and men of this village that occurred at Wounded Knee. So as time goes on, and the Native Americans are being forced into reservations, in 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, and the Dawes Act was passed for several reasons. Number one, it divides up the tribal lands, the reservations, um, and they did so kind of giving this land to tribes and to members of the tribe in order to allow them to have land to make farmable. In a way, trying to use some of the concepts of the Homestead Act. And in doing so, they're trying to aim in reforming the Native Americans to give up their ancestral way of life, the Paleolithic lifestyle, in favor of more of like white farmers, and make them more in the image of white men. And the reformers at this time think that they're doing good work, that this is a Christian and a noble pursuit to help Native Americans be able to provide for themselves. But what it ends up doing is essentially destroying their way of life and their culture in a lot of ways. The social structures of the tribe become weakened because of this. And then, farming was not something that the natives took to very well. And because they didn't take to very well, they end up getting swindled out of their land by white speculators. At the same, so basically they lose control of a lot of their lands. And then what ends up being left for the Native American tribes is land that's not very good. It's not farmable. You really can't do much with it. And the reservations end up becoming characterized and stricken with things like poverty. And there's a lot more to the plight of Native Americans that it will take too much time to get into. But what ends up happening is essentially the Native Americans, who do live on reservations. There is a lack of economic opportunities, and then it comes with a lot of social problems that go along with that as well. Um, Now, by the end of the 19th century, pretty much not all Native Americans have been put into reservations. And then many of these reservations, there were schools that were built for kids to attend. And then basically they attempted to basically dress them, like whites, learn the language of whites and such and so forth, to try to reform them to make them more like us. And this ends up kind of essentially destroying their culture. There is a lot of Native Americans who still, preserve a lot of their history and culture and language, but it is disappearing over time. And that is a sad fact that is going on. So, okay. So let's go back to the essential question one more time. I messed up on that one. So, identify and explain 3 ways in which America changed as a result of industrialization and Western expansion. Okay, make sure that you're using examples and you're explaining how those examples transform America and so forth. Okay, this lecture will probably be the last one for U.S. history until I get back. Unless you are doing distance learning, this will be just kind of a continuation of that. But that is it for me. I will see you all hopefully very soon after Labor Day weekend. Everyone stay safe and stay healthy and take care.